Ready? Okay, good. So the class Insecta, again, this is that group. We got 3 body regions, open circulatory system, body composed of those 3 divisions, 3 segments of their thorax that has the legs on them. Most species of at least adults will have legs that can move around. There are some species like flies that don't, because they don't have to. They just have to move in and out of whatever they're feeding on. But anyway, that's typically 3 pairs of legs, and then 1 pair of segmented antennae, and then compound eyes. This ability to see things with a bunch of little individual units that can sense light put together in something that makes some sense, like a honeybee that can buzz around to flowers, and it has the ability sometimes to see in ultraviolet, which we can't see in. Some flowers have got patterns that you can detect. This is like eat at Joe's Pollen Shack, whatever. That is the best place. It's point right here. It points right to it, and so they're able to detect those things that are important to their, for their sight. Compound eye means it's made up of a bunch of little tiny segments that can sense light together. They run it runs to nerves that give them a composite image. So it's something like a prism perhaps, but more like a series of these prismatic things that stick together. For us, we have, if you go to the back of our optic region, you can see the retina, and the cells that we've got are light sensing, connect to nerves. It's just sort of like insects are sort of like inside out us in a way, because they're kind of out that there's many parallels to thinking like it's just sort of inside out based upon the embryology and stuff like that. So anyway, but that's a long story longer. But that's compound eyes. And we'll get to see some of those in some of the other specimens here. Let's see. So other things that are important to know about insects, they're inside out us in a way. So their nervous system, where's our nervous system located? Our main central nervous system. Like here, dorsal. For them, it's inside out. They have theirs underneath, down in the ventral section. So that's where their main sort of ganglia are. They actually have a brain structure inside here. It's a simple brain, but some wasps and bees have some really good memory capabilities and things like that. And then they have a long digestive tube and tract through their mouth parts. Two mouth parts, that's the digestive tract through there. This is actually a heart that has open chambers that pumps blood around the interior cavity. So it's in many ways inside out. So the exoskeleton's on the outside, all that stuff. And this model's worked very well. A lot of other things. There's your compound eye, the antenna, connected to the brain, certain sensation capabilities with food. They've got the mandibles and maxillae that have got palps that can taste before they eat. Is something I want to take in or not take in? Sort of like we have a tongue, but they've got like 6 mouth parts, whereas we just got this one mandible. For them, they've got 2 mandibles, a front kind of lip, bottom lip, 2 maxillae, and palps, and ability to, chew up and do lots of different things with the things that they have to eat. A lot of other components to it. I'm not going to go through all that, but again, there's our head, thorax, abdomen. Abdomen is where a lot of the digestive components are, and also the reproductive structures are located. So that's some basic stuff. I just taught insect morphology today, so I don't want to get into too much detail, but it's important to recognize that this system works supremely well for these insects in the habitats that they're in and for the food that they eat. Some of them have really tremendous ability to drink all the juice out of your plants or chew up all your leaves or things like that. And so we recognize some of that stuff. So anyway, I will kind of move on there unless there's any questions about that. Yep. Also, if you got questions, please feel free to stop me, because I can get going in a freight train sometimes when my students say so. All right. So insects, like I mentioned, have 28 plus orders of different ordinal combinations. So that is things like the hemiptera, the true bugs. That's a real, stink bugs, and so many different species of bugs that suck the juice out of plants. Coleoptera, the beetles, the largest group of anything that ever, largest order of anything that ever existed. Lepidoptera, the butterflies and moths. That's, these critters that have got these scale-like wings. Diptera, the flies, very, very large order there. This one is Siphonaptera. So basically, they siphon the blood out of their victims. They have this pump that allows them to do that. And then here is the louse. This is a body louse, which is even sometimes worse than the head lice. That's part of that Therapter. That's a different order. These are just 6 orders. There are 28. So my students have to learn a bunch of these orders. They're not responsible for every single one, but they have to have a collection with 12 different orders. It won't take long to get that out of insects around here in Tennessee. Another order is the Hymenoptera, which means married wings because the wings are hooked together in one flapping surface. But that's wasps and bees and ants, et cetera. So a lot of different diversity of insects. This is an example of numbers of species that are documented. So I had to change the numbers on here. They had 300,000. It's like 400,000 known species of beetles on this earth. And most likely from rainforest species, a lot more. The insects themselves are at least 2 million species. Terry Irwin from the Smithsonian did some of his work in the rainforests in Peru. He found that in one tree, there were more species of ants than in all the British Isles. The tropics have some of the greatest diversity of these species. We also have got flies, over 150,000 species of of different kinds of flies. It's hard to believe, but there's a whole lot of those. The ants and wasps and bees, 125,000 and counting as far as diversity. And they're actually finding even more because many of these are parasitic and they're finding different species that feed on different species of insects, things like that. Beneficial sometimes. Then the butterflies and moths. These are the creatures that have got beautiful wings with scale-like structures that sometimes are really ornately colored or very dull colored to hide out in the bushes, things like that. So the butterflies and moths, sometimes we really run into some trouble with certain moth species and pests. And then, let's see, is that there we go. Then the true bugs, at least 50,000, probably a lot more in counting, that are they're plant suckers. And then the Homoptera, which is a part of the true Hemiptera, or part of the Hemiptera, 32,000 and counting, aphids, scale insects, a whole number of creatures that are part of that. Then there's scale insects that sometimes you may see on different plants, or actually mealybugs. True bugs means the Heteroptera, the ones that are classed in that group that have got piercing sucking mouth parts and hemelytron wings in their adult phase. It's a whole group that's a little bit different from the other ones that are called Homoptera that have got a different mode of life, but it's similar in that they suck plant juice. In that case. Dragonfly will be in their own order, which is called Odonata, those that fly with teeth. That's sort of the Greek for that. So that's its own group. There's so many different orders. I won't spend time going over all the orders, but these are some big ones that are very successful. And most of these are successful partially because they go through a complete metamorphosis. The very hungry caterpillar, starts from egg, goes into larva, feeds and feeds, and transforms into a cocoon and then a butterfly. That's the mode of life for a bunch of different species. Okay, there's some scale insects and things like that. There's a lot on there. Whoops, the life methods, let's see, modes, that's shown here. So this is there's the very hungry caterpillar. I just saw a monarch butterfly on a milkweed plant over at the Austin Peay campus in our little native gardens over there. And so basically they go through that process of transformation after they fed on the milkweed, then they will molt into a cocoon, and then we have that amazing transformation. Whereas, back in the early days, people didn't even think they were the same species because it looks so different. But what those insects did was they were able to come up with a method where the immature stage is just a feeding tube, in essence, that molts relatively simply and just is about getting as much food and nutrition and getting large enough, and then eventually transforming into the reproductive stage. And so in this case, this is a butterfly species that goes through an egg to the first larval stage, and then it will molt, shed its skin, go through a second stage, a third stage, a fourth stage, these are called instars, and a fifth stage. And then eventually, fifth stage into a pupa, a cocoon, some kind or other. And some of them will spin ornate, silk around them like a silkworm. But others are just very simply this little hard structure. And that's eventually what happens. Then eventually they will emerge as an adult and then go and do their reproductive thing. That is what we call complete metamorphosis. Butterflies, fleas, flies, wasps, beetles, a whole host of things that do that. Other species, though, go through something that is more what's called incomplete, but it was the way that most insects did it before they switched to that complete metamorphosis. So grasshoppers, cockroaches, true bugs, and other things like that, the hemiptera, they all start in a stage that looks a lot like the adult. You can see a grasshopper nymph, it has the legs and all those sort of things, versus that butterfly larva that's completely different. You wouldn't know that that's a butterfly if you didn't know anything about it, other than this dramatic transformation. Whereas the grasshoppers, they're going through a series of molts that they get bigger and they get wing pads as they get to some of these other stages, but eventually they get their wings when they're an adult. That's when their complete molt is. So 5 different molts in this case to go to the adult stage, and that's all the dragonflies, cockroaches, grasshoppers, true bugs, Homoptera, all sorts of things go through that incomplete or gradual metamorphosis. And you may see some of this stuff. I don't know if this is on the quiz that you all will get or the test that you'll get from Master Gardener. Metamorphosis is sometimes, it helps us to understand how to control some of these things too, to know their immature stages or not. Sometimes there's this thing that they call birth control for roaches. And so basically it prevents them from molting into the next stage. There's a series of different compounds that can induce or prevent them from turning into adults and not reproducing. Anyway, that's why we have at least some understanding of this when we're dealing with pest species. Let's see. So there's some really amazing creatures and reproductive methods. Some of them have the ability to give live birth, and also some of them have the ability to reproduce with unfertilized eggs. So the female, I can't draw this on the board, but the female basically starts out with an egg that is unfertilized, but that can become and eventually become an adult aphid. There's a reason for that. One of the things is if there's not a male around, they can still reproduce and reproduce dramatically and explode in populations very, very rapidly. It's called parthenogenesis, the ability to do that. So in essence, instead of having an XX pair of chromosomes or an XY, it just has an X blank. And so aphids have that ability to do that until it turns into the fall, when it's time for them to transform into winged creatures. But this group of insects sometimes can really rapidly reproduce, because each one of those puts out 25 immatures, and each one of those puts 25. It won't take long till they're going to eat up whatever bush that you've got or plant that you've got, and rapidly do that. There's one weakness with this, and that, fortunately for us, in that it doesn't have the diversity of sexual reproduction. So therefore, it's a sitting duck for fungi and other pathogens that will kill it. In various crops at certain times of the year, when I was working with Mississippi State Extension, there's a series of fungi that come in and destroy aphids in crops, just absolutely wipe them out, because they're simplistic. They don't have genetic diversity. In nature, diversity is strength. It is one of the most important things when it comes to most aspects of diseases or pathogens or other kinds of things in nature. So aphids, that's, again, some say aphids suck because they drink plant juice. Somebody had a T-shirt at the bug conference that said that. Let's see. I want to see if I can transfer over to this one. Well, in a minute, I'm going to see if I can get this scope to transfer over. This is a milkweed leaf that has milkweed aphids on it. And eventually I'll show some of that, but I don't know that I'm going to do that until Carla gets back here. So I'll go on, but we'll have a chance to look at some of those a little bit. Any questions about any of that stuff?
How quickly do they reproduce?
Sometimes in like 3 to 5 days, they've got a fresh offspring, and then this one, 3 to 5 days, it's a fresh offspring, and then you can imagine the kind of expansion of populations. So their thing is get there, take over the environment, dominate it, and then figure out the rest later. But if you get this fungal disease comes in, it'll take them out. Yes. There are others that are, but when they have that full component of genetics, sometimes they have better resistance to it. Just like anything, when you have a purebred something, there's chances are it won't have that genetic diversity that sometimes is important for the slings and arrows of nature, whether it's disease or famine or whatever kinds of things, or escaping predators. There's a whole bunch of stuff I can get into about that, but this is not a genetics class. But that's just one weird way insects reproduce. Most of them reproduce by sexual reproduction, and so they're going to go through the whole process of fertilized eggs and that thing. But this is just to give you an example of what we're up against with some pest species.
Somebody wants to do that. Ants like aphids and then they harvest.
Yes, yeah. Basically, they're not eating the aphids themselves, but the aphids, when they're drinking plant juice, they're pulling up all this sweet sugar stuff, and we would think that's great stuff. But for them, they need to get proteins and other amino acids. So they excrete it out these two little tubes called cornices, and it's the sweet honeydew. And I'll show some pictures in a little bit here. But that is this, they don't need all that extra sugar. And so as they cast it aside, ants will come along and take that back. Of course, it's a very nutritious thing to feed their offspring. And they'll tend them like little aphid cowboys, that kind of thing. Just kind of, in essence, or dairy cows or something like that. But they'll defend those little aphids against parasitoids or predators that want to eat the aphids. And so they've worked out a symbiosis with the aphids. There's a lot of symbioses in nature, and that's one that doesn't work so well for our plants. So, yes. We'll get to that in just a minute. We're going to talk about that. Definitely. There's a whole section on the kinds of things they do to crops and stuff. I'm just kind of going over about insects first. I'm probably spending a lot of time. Yes. Question. Oh yeah. That's their favorite food. It's aphids. Immatures, like both the adults and the larvae of the ladybugs that's their favorite, for sure. So let's see. So this finally gets to this point. Why should we care about insects? I mean, you've already got to see some of the reasons why, but when we talk about this, part of it is that all insects aren't enemies, even though we might think so if we're looking at our gardens. There are so many species that are beneficial to humans or just part of the ecosystem. So honeybees, obviously, pollinators, beeswax, propolis, all sorts of different components that they produce, and all the pollination. Then scarabs. The sacred scarab of Egypt was basically, it seemed as though it was rolling this ball along, and so thus the ball of the sun across the sky, a giant sacred scarab would be doing that. I don't know, that's a bit of a stretch, but in various places, they take manure and put it underground before flies get a chance to turn it into a real mess, and they're fertilizing the soil. So they're waste management engineers. I had some colleagues in Australia who had problems because cattle, sheep, and other things like that produce much larger poo than their native beetles could take underground. So they had to find a species of beetle, of dung beetle, that they could import to do that wasn't going to cause trouble. And so they spent a bunch of research, the CSIRO, and they've got something that is helping them with, otherwise there'd be lots of manure. So, or lots of flies that can cause other issues is what their issue was. But anyway, that's important. Waste management and aphid control for sure, just like that. Yeah, very important. there are many different beneficial components of insects. Pollination is obviously one that we are recognizing in a major way. With some of the collapse of bee colonies, we were starting to experience some of those issues, and native bees as well. Very, very important for so many different of our crops to be pollinated by bees or other pollinators, flies, wasps, beetles, and even butterflies. Obviously, a very important feature. Also, that bees and others produce a lot of useful products. So honey and silk, various dyes like cochineal scale that produce that brilliant crimson red dye, waxes and other things like that. There's this shellac originally comes from scale insects. Obviously very important stuff. Biocontrol agents. I'm sorry, I'll just do all these pictures. Things like lady beetles, things that feed on these pest species that we might have trouble with otherwise. Decomposers, the dung beetles, and then as food and feed. You don't necessarily think about this, but insects are a very important food source for things like chickens, pigs, and aquaculture fish. If you can have these insects that feed on decomposing matter or break it down, then you feed those to those things. It can be part of a food system that makes better eggs, other things like that. Chickens are definitely omnivores when it comes to insects. Also, in other parts of the world, 2 billion people choose to eat insects as part of their diet. It's a delicacy, sort of the way that crayfish or crabs or other things are. And I've tried the various types of insect things, including these little beetle larvae here that are called mealworms. They feed on, they're grain fed, a bunch of these little mealworms that you can saute up. I don't do insect sushi, but you can saute them up and salt them, and they're kind of like, just snacks or something like that. But lots of protein in them, and they don't use as much water. So many parts of the world in the tropics, this is an important food source. When I was in Cameroon in West Central Africa, that in certain places is a very important nutritious food source. Termites and other things were fed on. If you cook them, they don't taste like chicken, but it becomes an important source of protein in a way that doesn't require a lot of water. So, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. It's even in the Bible. In Leviticus, there is, of these you may eat those that go on 4 legs with 2 above their abdomen. That is crickets, grasshoppers, and locusts. And so there's also another passage with John the Baptist. Anybody know what John the Baptist ate? Locusts and walnut. So yeah. So he read his Leviticus, and so, but anyway, but it's actually kosher for certain times of Passover because the Israelites had to sometimes feed on grasshoppers and crickets in the desert. I'm not going to go any further into that, but if you got any questions, I can talk about entomophagy later. That's some beneficial things. However, one of the reasons we are going to study these is because insects can cause damage. So damage to people by direct attack, as many of us have experienced from time to time, either from stings or other kinds of things, or, mosquitoes. I mean, they have been responsible for more death than warfare because of the diseases that they can vector, unfortunately. So having ways to manage them is a very important thing. Mosquito abatement is a whole process and projects that we try to do to reduce. At one point, the city of Memphis was in essence disbanded because of the yellow fever epidemic in the 1870s. So it is, very important to know how to control it. We don't deal with that in Master Gardener, but that's one reason. They're also damaging to livestock. There's a flea, a number of different insects that will cause damage or vector diseases to livestock or pets. They also cause damage to let me go back. They also could cause damage to possessions, our houses. We take all this wood from the forests and we build our structures out of it. And then the insects that evolved to break those things down in the forest come to us and feed on that wood. Mostly they're very, very important for decomposing wood and other products in the forest. If they didn't, we'd be up to our necks in dead trees. So termites and other critters that do that are, problems when they eat our dead wood in houses. So we have to come up with ways to control it. There's a whole industry dedicated to that. Again, topic for another discussion, but that's another reason. And then for us, it's plants, where we're dealing with insects that are, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Insects that are damaging plants, whether that's crops, forests, ornamentals. They are, if there's a plant, there's at least several insects that feed on it. And it's just part of the process of plants evolving on Earth and insects adapting to them and feeding on them. So we have to deal with those in many different ways because they can cause trouble by rasping or scratching, laying eggs, producing wilting the plants, chewing, producing galls, kind of nasty looking galls, stippling them, boring into the trees, leaf mining, chewing, and doing all sorts of different kinds of damage to the things that we hold valuable, at least. Sometimes it's devastating when you get some of these invasive species that come in, like the emerald ash borer. And it's marched through Tennessee and destroying native ash tree species. It originally was one that came from Northeast Asia in wood chipping dunnage, got out in the port of Detroit, and has been spreading ever since. So Montgomery County will, it's in Davidson County, Cheatham. It's been moving westward, and we'll probably be getting it, shortly, unfortunately. Anyway, that's, there's a lot of different ways that insects impact us, and part of the reason why we're talking about a class like this. Part of it is because of their mouth parts and what they do with them. Chewing mouth parts are adapted for chomping on all kinds of numbers of plant species. So leaves and wood and bark and roots and so many different kinds of ways that they can devour plants. Insects really do that in major ways. This is a caterpillar that's trying to look kind of like a bird food and camouflage itself, look like a leaf. As it's doing it, it's chomping down, feeding on it, and it can get away with that sometimes before a bird might think it's something to eat. They've adapted to those sorts of things very, very well. Chewing is one of the ways they do it. There's some other chewing damage, and that's sort of the typical mouth parts of insects doing the chewing. There's some caterpillars devouring some leaves. They're just really good at feeding on plants. There are some leaf beetles that are basically scraping off the surface and leaving behind this kind of understructure like that, or the overstructure of that, depending on the species. Leaf beetle larvae. Usually it's the immatures that do a lot of damage. Then there's the sucking insects, like the true bugs and the hoppers and other types of things that have that ability to have mandibles that can go into there and then kind of, they spit up a little and then suck the juice of the plants. They have to kind of start that process by putting their saliva and then sucking it up. And then that starts this flow of liquid through their bodies. They can really do some damage, like the aphids and other things. There's some series of different kinds of damage by those. There's some wilting and things like that you might see if you get a bunch of these plants. Sometimes it happens to fresh, tender vegetation, little seedlings that are popping out, just little baby leaves, and then you get these aphids that suck on them, and when they grow, they're just deformed. They've been hit while they were really young and really, really damaged that way. Particularly seedlings early in the season are sometimes a problem. Have to protect it. Let's see. Also feeding on fruits, and things like that. Like this time of year, I have a bunch of tomatoes that are left over, and the stink bugs are just going all over it. And there's a bunch of little pock marks and other things. And sometimes you'll start to see, when they get in there, they might also spread some bacteria and cause it to slough off and stuff. So it's, this is a time when we have lots of insects because we've had several generations, and it's the end of the season when they're just about everywhere. Let's see. Others will do this thing that's called rasping sucking. So they have a mandible that rasps and then a sucking kind of side of their other mouth part. And so in this case, this is called thrips. Plural is thrips, singular is thrips. I don't know why they named it that way. But these are little tiny creatures that are maybe like a couple of 3 eyelashes wide, something like that. But they can get into those little plants and they'll start scraping the surface and sucking the juice. And if they hit little plants or little tender growing vegetation or buds, they can really cause some bizarre damage to them. They can also yes, there's some species when I was working in Alabama that would bite me. Sometimes get little kind of pricks like that. But mostly they're not going to drink blood or anything like that. But this is, there's a bunch of kind of smaller ones, scraping on the surface of leaves. Sometimes you really got to have something like a loop to see some of those things. You can see them in flowers, but when you're looking at fresh green vegetation, they may blend in with it and cause some troubles. There are a number of different ways to do that. Sometimes it does involve a series of different kinds of compounds. Sometimes a neem seed extract can be used if you're going organic. That works for a while, and then it rains, you got to reapply. Maybe pyrethrums and things. I don't know the exact list of those botanicals. There's also a bunch of synthetic organic pesticides that can be used against them. And the Extension Service usually has the most recent kinds of info on that. Sometimes you can do row covers to keep some of those things out, stuff like that. Sort of obstruct a mechanical method of exclusion, stuff like that.
I had a back problem with ceiling dahlias and I used nematodes. And then I covered them. And that was the best thing.
That worked. Okay, good.
Far.
So you found where'd you get your entomologist nematodes? You ordered them online? Okay, good. There's a type of nematode, a little roundworm, that feeds on certain insect species. And so there's several different kinds of varieties of those that you can get. Key is you got to get them shipped to you, and you don't want to leave them in the back of your car on a hot day because they can die, desiccate. But there are a series of entomologist nematodes that are both useful in soil and for some of those. So that's really cool. That's, sometimes that's the only, biocontrol that will work for something
Really
like that.
expensive.
They are, yeah, it's expensive. I mean, I have not invested in them for something like that. But there are ways, but they're expensive. I had some friends who went into that after I got out of undergraduate, and they found some ways to do that. It's not cheap. Other questions? All right, so thrips, rasping damage, other kinds of damage. There's some, kind of shrinking and wilting of that. Damage to fresh, tender fruits and things like that. There's a number of things that they can do to those and flower. They particularly love feeding on flower structures because when they're first emerging, they're some of the tenderest things the plant has invested all its wonderful energy into. And they'll cause some damage to those. Let's see. Some insects will get inside of the leaf matter. We think of a leaf as flat, but they have a thickness and series of cells. The critter can get inside there, an insect immature or something. They're going to mow through there and chew all that rich photosynthetic material, all those plant cells that are photosynthesizing. And then they leave behind this kind of empty spaces in the leaf. So you can see that's kind of what it might look like there, this kind of yellowing hollowed out area where they've chewed up all the wonderful greenness. And so if you peel that leaf surface off, there's what you're going to find. A series of little larvae that may be feeding on. Sometimes it's a fly larva. Sometimes there are wasp larvae that do some things like that. So in essence, they're interior to certain leaves, they're feeding on them. Lots of different mechanisms because there's so many species.
What's interesting is that
sometimes it can be overwatering damage. It's true. It's possible. That one, this is not super common, but sometimes you can see it. Sometimes I see it when I'm out in the woods where there's certain wild plants and they've got these little crazy little clear little lines on the inside. It's been this little fly larva that's gotten inside and just fed through and sort of skeletonized on the inside of it. Lots of, again, because you have so many species, there's so many different ways these things can happen. Yes. There is a similarity to them. It's a different kind of species per se, but they do some damage to the joints of wheat at a certain time when it's kind of in that certain early growing stage. And so they lay their eggs in there, the larvae kind of go, particularly on the joints of the wheat, they'll feed in there and kind of weaken the plant. And you don't really notice it until you start to see the plants start to grow. You can see this kind of browning out of those plants. It's going to be similar to that. That's a Sudbrink, a midge species that does that. And it's, again, a fly larva that will be doing that. We have a wonderful, beautiful word in English for a fly larva. Anybody know what that is? Maggot. Yes, what a beautiful word. Anyway, but that's our, there's a lot of different sorts of things. But anyway, that's sometimes that's called that way. But yeah, that's similar to that. And it can be a big problem in wheat. Some years ago, they had stopped planting wheat with the fly-free date, which, they started planting in September or things like that. And the flies would get in, lay their eggs, and then they would have this problem with hessian fly. They went back to planting more in October when you are closer to the frosts and freezes, and therefore the hessian fly wasn't as much of a problem with that. But that's a method of sort of temporal control and that sort of thing. You can also get resistant varieties for wheat that help at least have some protection against it. All right, so there's some leaf feeding larvae. There's the midge. So it's a cousin to that's the adult of that little fly larva. It's a different species. It's a little more reddish than that one, but they're little tiny little things. That looks really big, but it's just kind of these little kind of gnat looking types of things. One of those species. There's a lot of different gnats in this world. That's one. Let's see what else. So here's some of that. The internal feeding damage inside a leaf. You may see that happen on some plants. There's one particularly pronounced feeding pattern on leaves and things like that. Yeah, sometimes they'll get into that, and there's a lot of rich green plant cells in there with all that wonderful chlorophyll, and that's what they're devouring up inside of that. Leaf miners, yeah. Yep. Leaf miners, and then there's also skeletonizers that are more scraping some of the surface off. But yeah, mining through that rich thing. And you can see sometimes they'll start out kind of small paths that get bigger as the larva molts, gets bigger. So a lot of fun with so many insects. I don't want to scare people off about this stuff because there's a lot of different ways that these insects will do this to feeding. They don't all hit at once, and usually it's going to be limited to the species that you've got. So identifying it, sometimes you've got, when you know the plant that you've got, then you can have an understanding of what species might be feeding on it. Some of these insects will also cause galls on the leaves. They get in there, they'll force the leaf to grow in a really odd way. Sometimes they're basically taking over and feeding on it, making them change the genetics so that they're producing these crazy, weird growths on there. And what it does is it allows their immatures to live inside of the galls, or they might be feeding on the inside of that. And so many different galls in the world that the plants, that the insects do to certain plants. They, can be, they can become a problem. Many times it's more about how they sort of disfigure the leaves and things like that. But there's some galls that insects produce that can be debilitating to some of these plants. Let's see, there's some other galls. It's not just insects. There's also species of mites that do that as well. Let's see, what else have we got? Sometimes it's a little critter that's like this. It's a homopteran, has a sucking mouth part that forces these leaves to grow in this strange growth, and it protects them from predators in the midst of that process. And so they're secluded in the outside world in this little nest, and then they can keep feeding on these cells. And the plant keeps putting out all these rich sugars and things, and they keep sucking it up. So that's part of that process. Others will produce things like this. This is an oak leaf gall here with the emergence hole. And that's not a true bug. It is actually a little wasp species that parasitize. So if you pull this apart and cut it in half, it's made this chamber with all these little tendrils inside. It's feeding on all that rich stuff, but it's also protected so a predator can't immediately stick in and get it. The adult looks something like this. This is a sygnithid gall wasp. She'll lay her egg in that leaf, and then the larva will hatch out, start to cause this really bizarre looking round gall. It's usually rather fresh and tender when it first starts out, kind of green, and then it kind of browns out. But mostly those are kind of puffballish, in that they're kind of empty and hollow. Other galls, though, cause some more pronounced damage to wood. If they get on the twigs, anybody see this on oak trees or things like that? There's a series of different galls that will do this, twig galls. And basically, they get in there when the twig is young, and they force that plant to produce these excess secretions, and then eventually it hardens into a woody stage. This, I think, is part of a moth group of species. The caterpillar feeds in there, forces the plant to grow this gall, and then it will emerge out. Or there's also a wasp species that do this. Particularly, I think the gouty oak gall and the horned oak gall are a wasp species that does this. We have a series of trees on Austin Peay campus that are pin oaks that were particularly susceptible to this. And so you can still see a few by the Foy Center, but a bunch of those trees were taken out because there wasn't much else they could do with them at that point. But that's this hard secretion, and then you can see when you cut it open, this is where the insects were, feeding on the inside of it, usually before it turned fully woody. So it's when it's kind of fresh and tender. Then at a certain point, over the winter, it's kind of hardened, and then they'll emerge out of those holes and go do the same thing again. So let's see, there is our wasp species that does that. The wasp, that's her ovipositor. She lays her egg inside there, and that's how that happens. And so unfortunately, you get a tree like this, and you really, not much you can do but take that out. It's just, there's not much that's going to happen with that. A lot of times you may see one or two here. It can spread and grow. I've noticed them on pin oaks in particular. Those are non-native species that are particularly susceptible to some of these. Some kind of, looks like that. There are a number of books that help you identify galls of different species of things that might be on some of those plants. It's not always going to be insects. Sometimes there are fungi that will do this, or bacteria, or even viruses that will cause galls on them. But that's a particularly bad infestation that has gone on a long time. But many times you'll see some of this stuff on oaks.
Galls are fairly big, and certainly they're not going to get that big overnight. You think the shortness of an insect life cycle, how do they have time to like multiple generations of insects in there?
Well, I don't know how many generations are going to be in each individual gall. Usually that's the process of one season's worth of growth. But it's usually on when that part of the plant was tender, and then it kind of gets that way. Then sometimes the plant will also put growth, around it, and that's why then you'll get some growth around it. So I think that's a combination of that in this image. But there's a bunch of different types of galls that you're going to see on plants. Let's see, what else have we got here? Other things can include egg-laying stars. So in this case, a female took her ovipositor that's kind of like a stinger, laid it into that section, and injected the egg in there. So the egg would at least have a place to grow and hatch out. This is one that we will probably be seeing a bunch in the Nashville Basin next year, because it'll be the time of the periodical cicada. The 13-year cicada is going to come out that time. My youngest son was born in '98. That was a big cicada year, and then every 13 years it's been doing that. So that is, again, sometimes it will cause the tree to kind of break open and slough off if there's enough of those injection sites. Sometimes there aren't that many of those, but that's when you see at the end of one of those outbreaks, like goes from May to June, you'll see a bunch of these kind of dead tips on trees. Big trees don't really have that much of a deal with it. But if you've got a fresh, tender tree in your yard, some people will cover them with this kind of cheeseclothy material to keep them off. You got a new seedling that you planted or sapling. It's sometimes good to cover them in that late May to June period if you have it close to the Nashville basin. I don't think we have as much of that here in Clarksville. It's not exactly part of that brood, but as you get closer to Jolton down to that basin there, it's just deafening when those 13-year cicadas are out. Well, basically, they lay their eggs, and the larva emerges from its egg, hatches, and drops to the ground, and then burrows down. And then 13, they're not feeding on it. It's predominantly that. I think they may feed a little bit, then they pop out, go to ground, and then they're going to feed on that tree's roots for 13 years, kind of plowing through the soil. There is one benefit that they actually do that's not devastating to the plant, and that is they aerate the soil. So they get bigger and bigger. They have these really strong forelimbs that you can see on the little cast skins. They are digging through that earth, providing air holes for water and other things like that. But they're also sucking the juice out of that tree, and so they'll go way down into some of those roots. Feed for 13 years. In further north of us. So in Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania areas, it's a 17-year cicada. Weird thing, it's like every 13 years or 17 years, a prime number, these insects flood the market with adults and reproduce, and then they're done. They go to ground for another of that cycle. Up north, it takes longer for them to develop because it's cooler, and so they think that's why it's 17, and down here it's 13. It's warmer.
They're the ones they added.
Where was that one?
Indiana.
Yeah, that was another brood. There's so many different broods of those around the eastern United States, and so some are going to come out in different individual years. But that was a big year, and I think it was also one of the years it was in the Northeast, and so the Northeast media gets out and makes big news out of it.
The dead parts.
Yeah. Yes.
Interesting.
It's an explosion, a giant party, and then it's all over. But yeah, there's some of the loudest things that you can get decibel wise. It's incredible. Yeah, they have these membranes that are shaking and making all that noise, and they get into sequence. It's like, what's that?
No.
They do. They have piercing sucking mouth parts. Yeah, they can drink the juice of plants too. Yeah. Yeah, they're not going to bite you. If you're a plant, they might try to take a drink or something. Yeah, question.
So we come out every 13 years, but occasionally someone gets out.
Yeah, well, yeah. Every year we get the dog-based cicadas that come out, the ones that are that sort of thing, or there's a whole different species of those, and some of them are going to emerge at least at different points each year. It's just this one here that has its crazy red eyes, magic cicada, and there's a few species of those. They have this cycle that help them avoid predation or something like this, they think. Some say that's not true, but that's what some of the theorization is. But that is, that's one that comes out every 13 years. But every year we get cicadas of different kinds that make noise in the summer. Usually I start hearing them in late June or July or things like that. And then, yeah. Yeah, it's for them, that's just sort of the process that they'll go through. But yeah, it's an amazing phenomenon that happens, at least with these large 13 and 17 years. Anyway, but that's some damage that you might have, particularly next year if sometimes we get part of that brood that's here in Montgomery County, but it's not as much as say Davidson and that whole area down there. Let's see. Others are going to do egg-laying injury by chewing on the branches and knocking them off. So this is one where you can get the whole twig is girdled on a tree. They're kind of chewing around it. This is one of those critters right there. Beetles that will girdle around the branch and they basically chew that off, and that'll eventually kind of fall off and break off. Sometimes you'll have those. That is, depends on which twig girdler that is. There's a series of, there's one that actually that feeds on soybeans that we had to deal with, a crop species. But there's a whole number of different ways that they can lay eggs and chew and damage. The larvae will grow inside some of these stems and kind of feed on the developing wood. Some of them are really powerful mandibles that can chew up a lot of that wood, and really cause some damage to those. Let's see. Others, though, of these beetles will get underground and feed on plant roots. So it's a number of species. Whoops, let me go back. Need to go back one. So the June beetle group, this is the giant, there's a rhinoceros beetle, a Hercules beetle, a Goliath beetle, but that's one that we have here in North America. Then some of these critters, like these are June beetles of a different kind. That's another June beetle. And then there's a few other species that'll go underground and basically feed on organic matter, particularly plant roots, and cause some trouble that way. Now, this one isn't so much a plant root feeder. This is a predator, a ground beetle, likes to feed on a variety of different other insects. But when they get under there, they're going to produce little larvae, C-shaped larvae that are going to be kind of like that. These are beetle larvae, 6 legs there. They're kind of little C-shaped bodies, and they're chewing on plant roots or whatever else they can kind of get as they plow through the ground underneath. Some ways they're protected, in some ways they're vulnerable to other predators underground, but mostly we don't see them until we see, plants that are starting to look a little peaked or weak or things like that, and they're chewing up some of that. Some of them will chew various crop species at the roots. Some of them are, they're pretty decent size. There's this one June beetle, Philophaga, that will, it's about the size of your thumb, and sometimes you see them crawling on their back to go pupate in another place because they can't crawl on their bellies. One that we particularly have trouble with is the Japanese beetle. They call it the Japanese beetle, Papillia japonica. This is one that got out in the eastern United States back a long time ago and has been spread ever since. I grew up with them in Maryland, in the 70s, et cetera. They were all around. They didn't really get here until about the 80s and start causing trouble around here and then kind of spread and grow. But they're going to feed underground, and then eventually you see the adult stage. It's going to chew on the leaves of roses and apples and all kinds of other plants they like to feed on. They can become a problem, particularly because they'll just eat up all the leaves on some of those plants as adults. The big issue is underground. If you can control the underground populations, you can reduce the amount of adults that are going to be in a given area. And there's a type of Bacillus papilliae. It's a bacillus bacteria powder called milky spore that you can, use your lawn fertilizer to spread out in your lawn. And that bacterium kills this species. It basically, when they get in there and they feed on it, it will kill them. If you get enough people in your neighborhood to do that, you can get a reduction in these larvae. It isn't necessarily going to stop, say, flying adults from coming in, but it reduces those populations. It's cousin to BT. It's BP, like Bacillus papilliae, sometimes called milky spore, or one of the trade names was Doom. But it's specific to that. Papilliae is specific to the Japanese beetle. It's larvae. And it's moderately successful, but the key is making sure you have a large enough group and area to have that control it in the soil. They can sometimes. I mean, mostly they're going to feed on what's available nearby, but they can be blown in some cases. So it's not that's not a perfect answer, but it's somewhat satisfying to know the larvae are being killed, and it's not going to mess up your roots and things. They have those traps, Japanese beetle traps, and at least some of the extension entomologists I've known have said you can get an extension trap. If you get those, they have a pheromone that attracts them, but you may want to give it to your neighbor down the street or something. Because they bring in a bunch of them, and sometimes they don't catch them all, and so then you get more Japanese beetles. So it's not a strong recommendation for that product. So anyway, so there's some of those issues. Japanese beetle, what are some of the controls? I mean, I know for years they've used 7, things like that. What are they using for control of Japanese beetle these days? Okay. Right. Start chewing through the. Okay. That's, so yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. That's a philophaga. That's philophaga. I mean, many times, if you get a certain rain and it's wetted down, they gotta get up and find another place to go pupate. Or sometimes they just want to pupate in another place, or they're directional. Yeah. I mean, mostly they're not familiar with sidewalks and things like that. They would have just had this big lawn and then they thought they were going to go to the right place and they ended up not being right. It's not necessarily like they're lemmings jumping off a cliff. They're trying to find a place to pupate, turn into that next stage. That's the. Yeah, that's my educated answer. It might be wrong. That's a good question. Some of the things like Bacillus papillae is specific to Japanese beetle larvae. So that's that DP version of thing Doom that they've used. Now, other chemistries may cause trouble to other species that are in the soil, and so that's a potential, deleterious side effect of that. It's there used to be these really terrible, crazy, awful things like methyl bromide. They used to just destroy the soil with these chemicals that you can no longer use anymore because they're very, very toxic to us too. And it would kill everything like weed seeds and worms and whatever else. Not recommended because unless you want just bare dead soil, or something like that. Invasive species. They came here without their natural enemies, and so they have an advantage. There are a few species of fly that parasitize the Japanese beetle, things like that, and some other things underground. And nematodes also have an impact. There's a type of entomogenous soil nematode that you can put out that will kill some of them. I don't know that it's significant enough to merit the cost. That sort of thing.
I just looked.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Right. They've tried to make these that have lower mammalian and bird toxicities, but it doesn't necessarily. It's not going to stop it against other insects. So let's see. So we're at a point where we start talking about different insect plant diseases. Is this like we're about a third of the way in? Is this the time to take a break, or is it time to keep on going? We need to take a little break. Like how long do we go? Okay. Okay. I can keep going too if we want to do that. I don't know what's the best break. Okay, good. Sounds good. And you can take a look at some of the specimens we got up here. That's the specimen. Get a look at it.
No, no, just.
Should I rest the projector or just, let's see if I get some pictures. Got all kinds of different things here. Some of these are beneficial, some of them are pests. I can see. Could have been. They're predators in a way. There was a point in parts
Oh,
of
that's
China back when
bugs.
they had
There's the mildew.
encouraged nests
Oh, yeah.
of red wasps all over their farm fields. And that gets a little
Look,
rodent
this poor daylily.
Oh,
tree
yeah.
wrong or something like that. They'll go eat a lot of caterpillars.
That's not good.
I don't know. Friday. No.
This is. Yes.
Most of that sprayed them. One day. I do too, so you.
But even that was 25.
And this has gotta be rust. I don't know, it must be rust maybe off of the roses. I don't think this is nothing, yes.
Hate bugs.
Those are the, he said the, black-eyed bug that was a big crop pest in Cameroon.
I'm wondering if there's one
Chips? Yeah. Against, I mean, I'm gonna go run up and chomp on it today.
Let's go look.
To preserve.
Yeah.
Someone told me that it was like, yeah, like the things that are gonna eat them.
Yeah.
from where?
Like the Cameroon.
Yeah,
Black-eyed green beetles, is that what they're called? Black-eyed teas.
okay, so. Yeah.
Or did it say chickpea? Maybe it was chickpea.
It's just.
We found a praying mantis outside yesterday. Not this, the other one.
But here, isn't it?
Used to hate when you say.
Okay. So I would just say that's dead and cut it out. Does it have stuff in it?
No, it looks like it's kind of like,
Okay.
Is that the one that was tunneling like this? Kind of went in, it's like between the leaves.
yeah, you can see like it's surface damage rather than like being on the side. And then of course,
Okay.
as it's damaged, it starts showing signs of stress. These mealworms, just keep a bunch of rust piles in it. So the beetles are actually what hatched out of that. What I didn't learn about the beetles though until several years into.
Okay. So those are the common.
I mean, they're fun. At least not like in regards to. Yeah, it's like. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's it. It's like.
Somebody else can help now. This guy's on his back.
Yep, they're, they love us. Love us. Sure, sure. How we doing? We about ready to get on to the next stage. Now that it's 8 o'clock, I think we may want to get moving because I'm not even halfway through this apparently. Uh-oh. Looks like I got. They gave me this big slide set that Extension does for Master Gardener. So I want to make sure that you get at least a coverage of that. It's available on the share site, I think, for everybody. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So you'll get this whole thing uploaded to you. So I wanted to get a chance to go on to the next sort of stages here, so we can get this covered in our evening. And so with this one, so let me go to the next stage. So other things that insects do include. Do I need to turn this light off again? Okay, yeah. Okay, so let's everybody get in here. Other things that insects do are they're able to vector diseases, unfortunately. So that's not just the piercing sucking ones, which do a lot of it, but also the rasping sucking ones and even chewing insects can carry some sort of disease to a plant and cause a double whammy. Drinking the juice causing that, but also spreading a virus or a bacterium or things like that. And so that's a series of, this is I think this is watermelon. It looks like that. And it looks as though it's got a virus in it that was vectored by an insect. Sometimes it's by a piercing sucking insect or thrips that will scrape and rasp and suck on them. Let's see what else. This is a bean plant that has got a really bad mosaic virus looking like thing on it. So an insect probably vectored that one, depending on that. I believe that's why they're showing that from this is from the University of Georgia images that they downloaded. They have this great resource of a lot of pictures of insects, insect damage, and stuff like that. Let's see. Here's another one. Let's see if I can. Another one which looks as though, is that a pepper plant of some kind or other with this kind of mosaicing, in essence, mosaicing. So the virus in this case gets into the leaf and starts taking over the DNA and preventing photosynthesis. It makes copies of itself instead of this great, beautiful greenness. You see this modeling and other types of things on the plant. Let's see. And so there's an aphid that caused that one. So basically that aphid, as I mentioned, they'll insert their proboscis and and sort of inject a little bit of their saliva into it and then suck it up. That breaks that kind of sequence, and then the liquid starts flowing through it. Then it's going to extract all the nutrients out of that water and exert those honeydew out of it. So we get a lot of that. Here is an aphid illustration. These are these two little things, these tubes on the back called cornicles that put out this sugar honeydew secretion. And that's what, they put out lots of it. Sometimes there's one I'm going to show you that you may have dripping on your car sometimes. We'll talk about that. Yeah, and the ants love that sugar. It's as if, it's nectar for them. And so they take it back to feed their young. Their ants are very good at finding a lot of food resources. Here's a bunch of these aphids. There again, there's the mouth part sticking into it, and they're able to avert their stylet inside of that plant, and they're able to get a lot of plant juice. And they're just, for them, all they're thinking is they're getting, good, delicious, sweet plant juice or the other components. But unfortunately, they're vectoring a disease. And so we've got a series of things that will cause issues. So you'll get a combination of things with certain floral structures. Sometimes they get into that, and they're going to cause this, a series of different things, forcing the plant to grow in sort of weird patterns. Sometimes you'll get clusters of roses that will grow in a strange way, not be the kind of beautiful roses and things like that. Basically, that virus is what's doing it, but the insect is spreading. So insects can, again, cause that double problem. So if you can control the insects, sometimes you can reduce the viral diseases on the plant that spread. Let's see. Others are going to be mites. So I mentioned the arachnid group. So the acari is a part of that, is the area 5 mites. This is a little tiny mite. Its little legs right there and its little mouth parts feeding on that. And it can cause these strange growths and other things on that, forcing the plant to grow to its will, I guess, if you will. Let's see, where is that's the mite itself. And so they can cause some great damage, along with other insects, to plants. A series of insects can also cause some vectoring of other diseases. Some of them are bacterial and things like that. This is bacterial leaf scorch on a series of plants. So here is on American plane tree or sycamore, causing this, deadening of the leaves, this destruction of those. There's still some green on it. It also happens in oak trees, and sometimes there is a insect vector that is causing that. So this is a sharpshooter that can spread some of those diseases. And something like when it gets bacterial leaf scorch, is there an effective control for that today, or is it just taking the tree out?
Yeah. That's fair. We do.
Yeah, that's the issue. Fortunately, that's the I've seen that on pin oaks along with the galls and things like that. There's a series of things that love to hit pin oaks.
They try to do it flow through. Then it gets back.
So unfortunately, diseases can cause, rather dramatic problems to plants. So a lot of times that's piercing sucking insects, but it isn't always. Certain chewing beetles can vector those as well. Which gives me a lead to the next thing. This is what Amy put up there. The beetles. There we go. So the beetles are, again, the largest order of anything that's ever existed, 400,000 plus species. And so they have this particular structure on them, and that is this hardened shell, these wings that are really hardened. They're kind of like little tanks. moving around the world, and they've got a protection factor as a result of that. So they've been able to exploit so many different habitats. Some of these are plant feeders. Some of them are other insect feeders. Some of them feed on fungi. They're feeding in just about every niche that you can imagine on Earth, except for the extreme North Pole, extreme South Pole. But this is one of the greatest diversity stories of species anywhere. So with beetles themselves, we're talking about two pairs of wings and these elytras, hardened shell structures that really aren't wings per se anymore. They're kind of these hardened cases. They have to flip them out of the way in order to fly. So they've got these big membranous wings that help give them lift. But sometimes they're not very elegant. They're rather clumsy when they're flying. But all they got to do is get up in the air and they can fly some distances. But that's that elytra, that hardened shell. They've got the back pair of membranous that fold over. It's almost like an origami project. They fold them up in this intricate way. Nature has done that over the evolutionary time, and then they can pop them back out as they need. I was showing my students some video of that. I don't have that here, but it's kind of this in slow motion. It's kind of this clumsy thing where they're kind of lurching around, but then eventually they get themselves up into the air. Let's see. Their mouth parts are chewing mouth parts. Now, this is the head, I think, of a different species, but anyway, that is chewing mouth parts for most of these beetles, the vast majority. Many of them are plant feeders because they've adapted to plants. Sometimes when the plants evolved, they evolved to feed on them. Some of them are beneficial. They are really good because they are able to feed on other insects. So, this is lady beetles, very classic, feeding on aphids and other things like that, and other small insects. That's the larva. There's the pupa, and that's the adult. So sometimes they say this looks like a little alligator or something like that, but they're, to a little aphid, that's a deadly alligator. Chomp them up, eat them up. Because that's all they do. They just walk around a plant, eat aphids or other insects, eggs, or things like that. And so, but some beetles are problematic. They can cause significant damage to trees, wood, bark, any number of things. There's some pretty devastated trees from beetles. Some of them are going to feed on the bark, and you may see holes. You may also see some of this structure that they fed on the underbark. This is a pretty devastated tree, pretty much done. But there's a number of different beetles that can feed on it. These are some of the holes, the emergence holes. Sometimes when you've seen this, it's kind of late in the process. They sort of fed on the plant and gone out to do more damage. Some of those are what we call flat-headed metallic wood-boring beetles or flat-headed borers, the buprestid family. It's kind of a really flattened critter, and sometimes they have some of the most beautiful little colors on them. Greens, purples, very shiny iridescent colors that attract each other, for mating and other purposes like that as adults. The larvae, though, are something different. Let's see. Some of these metallic wood-boring beetles are active, as soon as we get the frosts are over and all the way up to the next frost, depending on species. Some species are active very much in May. This one species that is happening across Tennessee, which is the emerald ash borer, is one that's going to happen in the springtime, kind of at least when they start emerging. And they can, again, be devastating because they're invasive exotic that doesn't have much natural enemies to it. Some of them will pupate early in the spring to late summer, and then the adults cut the hole through the bark and emerge and then start the cycle again. Series of things. So these are feeding on a lot of hardwood species. We have various different kinds. You see a few species there, but the symptomatology, we're going to see things like loose bark, causing the bark to kind of slough off of the plant because of the damage and feeding underneath. Dieback of branches, they're going to destroy those, the components above, because basically they're sucking all of that rich cambium layer on the tree. If you're a tree, your fresh growing stuff is all around here. they're feeding on that underneath the bark, chewing through it. They form all the way around. They'll kill everything above it, which is what the emerald ash borer does. Let's see. This is a D-shaped emergence hole. And I guess that is a emerald ash borer. It seems a little big for one of those. Yeah, that's a fingernail. That's sometimes those D-shaped holes are very small for emerald ash borers, but some buprestids will do that. But emerald ash borer is very, very small. If you have a penny kind of flat like this, they're shorter than the length of it. So it's a very tiny little beetle. But the adult is the thing that you may see flying around. But what's underneath is this thing, the flat-headed borer. And there's several different species of these that feed on different trees. Some of them are natives and they're just part of the ecosystem here, but others are invasive. So it's this larva that feeds and then molts and grows and feeds and molts and grows. And so you start out with some small trails and things, but then they're feeding on all that rich cambium, that rich, nutritious part of the tree, and that's no good for that tree. It's damaging everything that's above it. So anyway, that's sometimes there's some pretty pronounced problems. We are about to get that one here in Tennessee, and the idea is don't spread that firewood to somewhere else where it can, carry that insect. That's one first and foremost. There are a few species of parasitic wasps that attack it that our colleagues at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville have been working with the Forest Service to help at least reduce some of their numbers. But it's kind of like the lions and the wildebeest. You have a species that, usually if you have enough of them, it's going to cause damage to that tree, unfortunately. So anyway, so let's see. Now, other insects, I had a question about the true bugs. Hemiptera is that the order of those insects, and hemi means half. So in this case, it's half wing. So it has a hardened structure on there and a membranous structure that holds it, looks like a hat. That's the best description of that one. There's a lot of species that do that. Cicadas are part of that group. Aphids, plant hoppers, spittlebugs, leaf hoppers, shield bugs, all kinds of things are part of this large order of insects. And they've got 4 wings, they fold them flat. There's a stink bug right there. So it's feeds on a lot of different plants, piercing, sucking mouth parts, drinking the juice of plants. Basically a leathery base and membranous sides. This one is a box elder bug that feeds on box elder bug. And so it's got a leathery structure here and these kind of membranous structures there. Again, what you don't see is the sucking mouth part, which is what they do their damage with. This one is a different kind. It is actually a predator bug that feeds on other bugs. There's its sucking mouth part. So it'll go to a caterpillar and just start sucking the juice out of it. It'll attack it, just go through and take all its fatty goodness out of the inside of the caterpillar. But they're beneficial in that regard. Unfortunately, if you get on the wrong side of this, it can hurt. So they can bite you. I've had a few that land on me. That's from a wheel bug, assassin bug, and I do this to them if they get on me instead of that, because they might bite you. It's kind of brush them off. But there are some beneficial true bugs, several species that are, the damsel bug feeds on a bunch of bugs, the minute pirate bug, there's a spine soldier bug, I think they'll show here in a minute. They're all beneficials. That's beneficials, the ones that, so they're egg nymph adults as opposed to egg larva adult. So the immatures kind of look like the adult. So they're walking around with legs, they've got most of the features but no wings. And so, stink bugs, do that sort of same sort of thing. Sometimes a stink bug has incredible, beautiful colors on it, like reds and greens and yellows, basically saying, don't eat me, I stink. Part of it. But you have a lot of different bugs. Some of these bugs can cause some big trouble. This is azaleas. And they can feed on the underside of those leaves, just kind of, devouring some of that plant material with their piercing, sucking mouth parts. That's sort of this fading color of it. And you can see this kind of speckled stuff. And there's some of the immatures of that group feeding, let's see, immatures of that group feeding on it. That looks something like this. That's a face only a mother can love, I guess you could say. My professor, Dr. Doug Talman, studied some of the stuff about this, the behavior of these things. One of the reasons they're so good is because their parents defend them and protect them. This is a case of parental care. This is the adult lace bug. See, it's kind of a lacy structure. Its wings, but they'll guard over these little immatures, and it gives them a selective advantage. And so, unfortunately, for our azaleas, it gives them an advantage over predators that might try to eat them. But yeah, Doug did that. He also wrote this book recently that's Nature's Best Hope, and a series of things that are talking about bringing back native plants to gardens and yards and things like that to help with wildlife. And recently, Austin P has done an initiative of the Healthy Yards system to bring back types of plants, shrubs that are natives that will help with various wildlife, including insects that are beneficials and birds and other things like that. Michelle Rogers is running that program, but Healthy Yards Initiative, stay tuned for that. I don't know if you all have heard from them about that. Okay, good.
If anyone has questions or.
Yeah, that's my connection. So Doug was my advisor when I was an undergraduate at University of Delaware, and he almost gave up on me at one point, but I stayed the course and managed to get through and all that stuff. But he's just he had so many really interesting things. One of his studies his students did, they studied those bug zappers, that are ultraviolet light. They think you're killing a lot of mosquitoes. What they found is mostly it's non-deleterious, non-pest species that it's killing. A lot of things that are just night-flying insects is zapping. It may be satisfying sound, but most of them are not mosquitoes. In order to track mosquitoes, usually you got to have dry ice, CO2, and also there's some other scents they say that mosquitoes are attracted to, like stinky feet smell or something, the bacteria from that. Anyway, it doesn't really kill mosquitoes, so it's not worth the investment unless you just like to have a light and have sounds good. But that's what his graduate students, they monitored it, did scientific testing on it, and they found, this is not really what it's sold as, at least. But anyway, that's his lace bugs. The immatures can cause this trouble as a pest species with azaleas. And as I showed you, if you see azaleas that have this kind of scouring on it, it looks kind of yellowed out and scored and scratched and things like that, that's from this insect here. True bugs. All right. I can get off on tangents, so I better keep on going. Homoptera. This is a group that has been classed with the Hemiptera, but they're different in several ways. They include the cicadas, so similar to stink bugs, but they have their own sort of differences. Again, piercing, sucking mouth parts are part of that. They're feeding on plants. All these Homoptera are plant feeders, as opposed to some of the others that are the Hemiptera that feed on other insects. They hold their wings roof-like over that, or they're non-wing. This is a scale insect. So this is a covering. Underneath of it is the insect feeding and sucking the plant juice, protected from above, so that it can't be preyed upon. They came up with these structures that give them protection. I've got some of those here that some of you may have had a chance to see of different types of scales, and they can really become an issue. I'm going to show some more of that in a second. Let's see. These are plant hoppers. You may see a lot of different kinds of these things, sucking juice and kind of skipping away or jumping away. They have spring-loaded kind of, some really interesting spring-loaded ways to jump away from predators. Let's see. And then there's other things that are, I'm supposed to get to that next. There are other insects that are part of this group that are things like mealybugs and alorotids, whiteflies. This is a whitefly, adult, kind of flying around, and it lays eggs, and its larvae will set up shop and make a waxy secretion on them to protect themselves. And then they're drinking the juice of your plants. Sometimes these are on ornamentals or other plants. Sometimes they're in greenhouses. They can get in there and really cause a problem. But they can also vector diseases, unfortunately. We have a lot to deal with them. There's aphids. We already talked about them a bunch. And then here's some aphids feeding on some trees, causing their wonderful sweet secretions that come out. And then those secretions will fall on the leaves, and then the fungi will take over. So you get this black sooty mold that grows on it, and the fungi love it, and the tree doesn't. But that's some of the things that will happen. That's tulip poplar. This is from a hackberry. There are a few species that really cause some problems with that. They leave behind sooty mold. There's our ant. There's an ant here that is feeding on the sugary secretions, taking them back to the nest, feeding their young. This was something that Amy found. Give me some sugar, baby. Anyway, but ants are tending these aphids. This one is a type of aphid that produces a waxy secretion on it to protect itself. It's kind of fluffy thing, almost looks like cotton candy, but it also puts out a bunch of sugar, a lot of it. On this time of year, this hackberry is they're covered with it, and they're just exuding so much sugar out of them and causing troubles. It will, that's what you get on your car when you're under a hackberry tree. It's just copious amounts of it, and then eventually the black mold will get on there if you don't clean it off, stuff like that. Sometimes that sappy secretion can cause, wearing away of your paint job and all that business. So it's a mess this time of year. There's what it looks like up close. So there's the immature and there's the adult, with all of that wonderful protective stuff on it. But then it's exuding all that honeydew. So that's one of those. That's the Asian woolly hackberry aphid. We also can get these scale insects that I was telling you. They look like little scales. Some of them are hard armored scales. Some of them are soft structures that are feeding on them. And so what's happening underneath of that is something like this. Here's the adult, basically feeding on the plant juice, laying eggs underneath this casing, this shield-like covering that keeps it protected from most things. However, some of them have parasitoids that little wasps will go and lay their eggs into that adult, and basically it will parasitize them and look like an alien. Will pop out again and go do the same thing. Some of them are armored, that is, they have a protective waxy armor secretion, and they're not going to produce honeydew. There's the scale on the outside to protect you. There's that's an adult female that would be feeding on the plant. Let's see. And so no sooty mold with those. Euonymus scale, the female armor in that case is dark, oyster shaped. Mature males have tiny two-winged insects that emerge and fly around. And the eggs are tiny and yellow, and the young crawlers kind of move around. Eventually they produce a series of scales. Euonymus is their particular favorite. So if you've got euonymus bushes, you will probably find some of these at certain times of the year on them, whether that's a shrub or the vines or things like that. And it can be a real mess on some of those trees. Multiple generations, like some insects, they can lay lots of eggs and produce a lot of generations on these plants. Here's some more damage to euonymus. Obviously, a problem. If you can get to them earlier in stages when the crawlers are coming out, that's sometimes some of the better control phases. You know what the products are for that, for euonymus scale and things? Right. Yeah. Euonymus is an exotic, sometimes invasive. Right. Yeah. When you talk about weeds, you talk about invasive species. That's an invasive species. It's better to plant the natives, even though they may have their own components. Yeah. So anyway, that's one of those types of scales. Other scales are soft-bodied scales or soft covering scales, seemingly soft. More noticeable and conspicuous in profile. You can see them really kind of running like a nodule off of there. This is what's underneath when they're basically become egg cases. Once that female dies in essence, she becomes this giant egg case. All these immatures that are going to eventually start crawling and move around and feed on the tree. Again, that's a stage where, if you can treat that in the dormant times, it can smother those cases and prevent them from being able to grow and damage the tree. Let's see. There's a series of little tiny ones. You can see it's just so many of them. Little tiny crawling legs. They move to a certain place, set up shop, molt into adulthood, and they just feed on that plant. Set up the scale, and they set up shop. Lots of honey. These produce a lot of honeydew too. Here's what it looks like on a tree. Those are all little scales. Almost looks like little knobs. That's individual insect scales on their feeding. That's the Lacanium scale. And so ants and butterflies and bees are going to suck the juice off of them, just like they do with the aphids. Let's see, what else have we got? Yeah, so there's a whole, this is encrusted. That's pretty intense.
If you find something like that, is it better just to figure out?
What do you say, Carla, about that one?
Oh my God.
That's a heavy infestation.
If you want to see a good example of what public scale, go to the County Library and just walk around the edges and look at those tulips. I mean, they were actually thinking about taking them out because the honeybees,
Right.
they're walking under it,
Right.
stuff like that. So,
I think I have some students who may want to go there and get their collections. So you can see the sucking insects really cause trouble. Fortunately. So there's some damage to trees. There's also another sucking insect called a mealybug. You ever see these before? Kind of waxy looking things. They can start with a few of them and then produce a whole lot, lots and lots of immatures. And they've got the levels of honeydew that are going to come off of those found all over the plants. They're definitely